Zoë Caron with WWF-Canada.
And there's usually a tagline underneath your name and movie?
Climate Policy and Advocacy Specialist.
Can you say your name one more time?
Zoë Caron. Zoë Caron.
Oh,
Zoecaron.
okay, cool. And what are you doing here in Cancun?
I'm here with the WWF team to work with bureaucrats and politicians to essentially move policy on a global scale that's going to keep climate change away from dangerous levels.
Okay. And COP16 for Dummies, what's happening here?
COP16 for Dummies. Basically, we're seeing, I guess, a bit of a conflict between developing and developed countries. So we've had Japan basically come out and say there's no way that we're going to continue on what is the world's only legally binding climate change agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, until developing countries all come together under a legal framework. Whereas you have the developing countries, most namely China, saying, well, there's no way we're going to do that until developed countries, i.e. Japan and all the other developed countries, do their fair share first. So you're seeing a bit of a conflict and heads butting in terms of what we're going to see in terms of the outcome. The good news is that all the solutions are actually on paper and we have a way forward. It's just taking the political will to really push it out the door.
And in terms of like COP, what is COP? Like coming here is a little overwhelming for us. You know, you see all these countries and these signs, but sometimes they're politicians, sometimes they're not.
Yeah.
What is that sort of happening here?
So COP has been happening for over a decade and a half, and basically it's the world's climate change forum. So it's the only time every year that you really have governments from around the world, from all 192 countries, coming together in one room and sitting down and talking about climate change and making decisions in terms of a global direction moving forward, so that each country can then go home and act on their own ground. And you actually have these conferences happening throughout the year to lead up to each COP. So there's about 5 or 6 conferences a year with bureaucrats, and the final COP, Conference of the Parties, is where all the ministers and high-level decisions are made.
Okay. And in terms of environmental issues on the planet, WWF probably works with a bunch of them. What do you think the biggest environmental issue we're facing is?
Well, climate change ultimately affects all environmental issues and exacerbates all environmental issues, so it's not really a comparable standalone issue against other environmental issues, so to speak. It's really intertwined with social and economic issues as well, to not a greater extent, but a much more perhaps immediate extent than other environmental issues. So while WWF focuses on biodiversity and conservation first and foremost, climate change is a massive, massive threat to biodiversity on this planet. It's a massive threat to our environmental systems and also to people on this planet. And so while we do have other program areas on conservation, this is a complementary piece that really works across all of our program areas to enable them to succeed.
How is climate change affecting biodiversity?
Well, as the temperature rises around the globe, you're seeing, I guess, the chemistry changing on the planet, really, in the atmosphere, right? So I guess first and foremost, the biggest threat is to our oceans. So coral reefs, for example, are very, very sensitive to the chemistry of the water. So oceans basically sequester and suck in carbon. So there's more carbon in the oceans right now. As more comes into the air, more is sucked into the ocean, and that's really changing what species. So as the chemistry of the ocean changes, that's changing what is able to survive. And when you think of the oceans as being really the biggest living force on the planet and sustaining so much other life on the planet, that's a huge worry. The bleaching of coral reefs being impacted by the temperature of the waters as well. Coral reefs being another huge life force of the oceans, part of the base of the food chain in terms of habitat. And then on land, what you're seeing is temperature ranges changing around the world. And while species have adapted in the past to massive climate changes, what we're seeing now is this climate change is happening, but there's also other human impacts on the planet. There's highways everywhere, there's cities everywhere, there's clear cuts everywhere, and animals are not able to migrate and move and adapt in a way that they might have been able to thousands and thousands of years ago. So you're seeing a collision of environmental impacts and climate change really affecting the biodiversity of this planet. And so if climate change went into its worst case scenario, we'd see at least a 30% further loss of biodiversity, which is a huge, huge deal. And then the oceans is a little more uncertain, but also more, I guess, of a an immediate concern to us as well. So that's really why we're working urgently to ensure that those levels of, that the atmosphere doesn't change to that extent, that the temperatures don't change to that extent to have that massive impact.
Okay. Now you've come a long way to come to Cancun. Like, what are you here for? Like, do you have kids? Are you fighting for your future?
I'd say I'm fighting for, my future, I guess, is a part of it, and knowing that I will be here for the next, hopefully 60, 70 years, if all things go to plan. But I guess I feel a moral responsibility to, sorry. I feel a moral responsibility, I guess, to everyone around me. The fact that I guess, understand this issue and that I am a part of working for solutions is something that I'm lucky to have been, or something that's been lucky to have been put in front of me. And so if I don't take that and use it to the best of my ability, then what have I done, I suppose. So yeah, it's for me, it's for people around me, it's for, sure, children to be, it's for the environment, it's for something that I can't even describe because it's a feeling, it's a moral ground, it's not it's a responsibility, I guess.
Is there one thing about this issue or these issues that the entire world should know?
I think that the world should know that what media reports on climate change and what the science reports on climate change are two completely different things. So over the past 20, 30 years, we've seen climate change science develop quite substantially, to the point where there's a 95% certainty level that humans are causing this climate change that we're seeing, and that these temperature changes are really going to have a massive impact if we don't do anything. And that level of certainty is almost unprecedented when it comes to the science. You have almost nothing that's 100% certain in this world, right? So if I told you that you had a 95% chance that your house was going to burn down, would you buy insurance? Likely. And you'd be kicking yourself if you didn't, right? So I mean, we have this unprecedented level of certainty, and because there's a 5% uncertainty, often people take the theories and other arguments, which do exist and rightfully do exist, but they're explained in a way that's a 50-50 balance. And so I think that that's really important to keep in mind when you hear, the science isn't good enough, we need to wait till more science comes in. I would, I guess, recommend to act on the precautionary principle of the fact that, the longer we wait, the harder this is going to be. And sure, if that 5% chance is right, great. But until then, we're working very hard to ensure that doesn't happen.
Now, from Canada, it seems like it's going to be a good thing if the climate warms up. It's already too cold. Like, what's the deal on climate change? Like, is it really that bad a thing?
Well, climate change, of course, is not just a temperature rise. I guess one of the biggest impacts on Canada of course, the ocean change is one thing. Life in the oceans is something that we're hugely dependent on, of course, in Canada. But secondly, as the temperature warms around the globe, and as the ocean temperature changes, and as the atmosphere changes, it really changes the entire climate, hence why it's called climate change. So what we're seeing is a higher frequency of storms, for example, more intense storms. So whether it's hurricanes or torrential downpour or snowstorms, you name it, it's a higher intensity and, I guess, less predictability. And just to give you an example, I guess, for hurricanes, they function off of the heat of the top of the surface of the ocean. So the warmer the surface temperature is, the faster that hurricane will go. So just one example of how a temperature change affects a greater extreme weather event, for example. So in Canada, there's, I guess, what we're trying to avoid is let's say more droughts in the prairies, coastal erosion in Nova Scotia, sea level rise on all of our coastal areas. As the temperature changes, of course, you have diseases being able to be spread to places they never would have been able to survive before. In British Columbia, you have the pine beetle suddenly being able to survive over winter because there aren't enough cold snaps to kill it, and so you have trees drying out, more susceptible to forest fires. I mean, this last summer we saw hundreds and hundreds of forest fires across Russia. I mean, Canada is in no different situation when it comes to that kind of a threat. And so, you know, it's not just an environment issue, it's really all around us. And it's so clear. And the science, it's not even just the science, right? We're seeing events that are confirming and confirming and confirming, I guess, over a larger range of time that's really allowing us to say, okay, it's actually what was projected is not only happening, but what's happening is worse than what was projected. So you're seeing the science having to be updated based on the facts now that have happened. And so as a response to that, I mean, Canada is also, on the flip side, in one of the best situations and is most able to actually react to climate change. We have a huge ability to shift our energy base to off of oil and off of coal and onto renewable energy. Sorry, I don't know if you want me to jump into the energy thing yet. Maybe I'll wait until you...
No, we can go everywhere. Sure.
Okay. I mean, at the base of climate change, of course, is our use of energy. So when you burn coal, when you burn oil, you release emissions into the atmosphere that are adding to climate change. And Canada, of course, we're largely based on hydro, but we also still use coal. We also still have a transportation system that is based on oil. And to shift that is in our best interest for a sustainable economy, but also to help contribute to this fight against climate change. And so we want to see that shift happen in Canada. It's being discussed, but Canada has yet to develop a national energy plan, which would be great to see. Canada has yet to pass a climate change law, which other countries have been doing for the last 15 years. So we are hopefully going to be able to do that in the coming years. But there's a slew of solutions that Canada can implement and that it can implement because of I guess, the level of progress that you've already seen in Canada, and as well as its democratic society to be able to do so. So Canada's ultimately well placed, and hopefully it will use that to the best of its ability.
Now, are people seeing the impacts of climate change yet, like worldwide? Like, is this actually affecting people?
Worldwide climate change is indeed impacting people. I believe it was a UNEP report that came out last week, and it's citing that climate change is killing hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and which is incredible. And when you first hear that, you think, yeah, right, like really, how can you actually make that link and say that something like climate change is actually killing people? But if you read through the report, it's unbelievable to see the increase based on all these impacts that are inextricably linked to climate change. And so now, of course, the unfair part of the story is that it's developing countries that are being impacted first and foremost. And when you look at the impact on Canada, while it may be delayed, it ultimately, climate change is ultimately impacting us, and we're starting to see it a bit in terms of impacts in British Columbia, for example, and most importantly, perhaps, in our northern regions. I mean, I went to the Arctic for the first time this summer, and we had to look for sea ice. Usually you're trying to avoid sea ice on all of the on all of the maps, when you're trying to navigate, and there was no ice. We were trying to find it, to see if it was even there. And the fact that the Arctic is ultimately being impacted is being seen in some lights as a benefit because of more oil exploration. But when you really think about that, more oil exploration is really, and more oil use is at the root cause of the issue of climate change. So it really is not a net benefit. And when you think about the importance of the Arctic to the entire world, the Arctic ice sheet is essentially like a mirror, and it reflects the sun off of the sunlight basically back out into outer space. And that helps as a temperature regulator and is one of the air conditioners, so to speak, of the world. And so that as that melts further, that exacerbates climate change even more.
How do we get people to do something about this? Like, what is the change that needs to happen? Because it seems like people have been talking about this issue for 30 years. Nothing's happened yet. We've had Kyoto. Nothing's happened.
I would argue that things have happened. Although we are not yet at the level of emission reduction and at the level of ambition that we need, we're seeing if you look at the last 20 years as a whole and compare it to before then, we've seen a huge shift. I mean, we have China committing to emission reductions. I mean, we have India as one of the lowest emission producers in the world. I mean, you have the United States trying to push through climate change legislation. You have Canada trying to pass through climate legislation. You have almost every country in Europe that will meet their Kyoto Protocol target. Almost every country will meet their Kyoto Protocol target, except for Canada and perhaps a few other countries. But I mean, we have yet to see. 2012 is the first deadline, but I would certainly say that there has been a monumental shift, particularly in terms of public awareness. And we're seeing that in polling. I mean, I see that when I go out for dinner with a friend. The level of awareness has completely shifted, whereas 4 years ago, a lot of people didn't know what climate change or global warming was, whereas now the majority of Canadians at least understand what it is, why it's happening, what the impacts will be. What we're not seeing is an awareness of the solutions, which is really interesting. So, but yet there is a huge support for what are the solutions, yet the link isn't made. So there's a huge support for renewable energy, there's a huge support for electrification of vehicles, for example, but the understanding that that's going to help us with our climate change issue is a bit of a disconnect. And it isn't a natural connection, but that's, I think, the level of awareness that now needs to be tipped over to the next level. And ultimately, the Government of Canada is one of the responsible bodies to deal with this problem in our country. And luckily, we're seeing provinces and territories take the lead regardless of the federal leadership. The Ontario Green Energy Act is perhaps the leading energy initiative on the North American continent. I mean, we're seeing a huge shift to cleaner and greener fuels, and more importantly, to conservation and efficiency of energy, which is really lowering our footprint on this planet. Quebec, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and others are being leaders in this field of energy. And so I think that to have the federal government step up would be a huge compliment to those efforts. And again, I mean, this wasn't happening 5 years ago, so it's a huge shift.
It seems to me when I look at the environmental problems, it's almost like we've built a system that's doomed to fail. We've built this giant infrastructure that is dependent upon destruction of the world we depend on for survival. If we sequester the carbon, we're still not going to have any fish, any reefs, any rainforests. How do we turn that around?
It's a big question. Ultimately, I think that there is more and more of an understanding of the fact that particularly rich, polluting, developed countries are living a lifestyle that is incredibly unsustainable. And what is really, I don't know if it's refreshing or depressing to see, but in these UN negotiations, on one hand you have the diplomatic, we will do this and this is the plan, but on the flip side you have presidents and prime ministers here that are blatantly calling out the most consuming countries of the world on their actions. I mean, Evo Morales did a huge speech yesterday specifically on the lifestyles of richer countries and how ultimately those countries are dependent on the resources of the global commons and the global good, and thus are depleting those resources of the global commons and global good. And when you think about it, yes, exactly. I mean, we depend on China for so much of our production. We say, oh, China's emissions are going up, but look at what products they're creating, look what their factories are doing. It's all for us. And so it's for sure a huge disconnect, but I think that the level of awareness is really growing at a very rapid scale, and the number of individuals and organizations and communities that are engaged on this issue are continually on the rise, which we're seeing again in polling, and which is really encouraging to see. And this is specifically in Canada. And so I think that we're at a tipping point where people are really coming forward and demanding that higher level action, because everyone has their own role. Individuals are starting to live differently in Canada, but we can only impact about half of the way we live. The rest is dependent on a bigger system, right, which is influenced by government, which is influenced by laws, by policies, by the markets. I mean, there's a huge shift that needs to happen. At the same time, I mean, this weekend there was the World Climate Summit hosted at the same time, and you had massive companies and corporations coming forward and saying, okay, we know that this climate change conference is happening, but let's talk about what we're doing. And regardless of the decisions they make, how are we going to shift our markets and our supply chains and our impact on the planet to complement what's happening here, regardless of laws that are placed on us. So, and you even see some businesses in Canada being angry that there hasn't been laws put in place yet, because it means they're lacking certainty on how to conduct their business, thinking, will I or will I not have to deal with a climate change or emissions regulation, right? But they're acting in the event that there will be one, which is great.
Well, what makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful? I suppose that I see change and progress on a regular enough basis that I am still here working on this issue. I mean, the very first UN climate change conference that I came to was absolutely phenomenal. It was hosted in Canada, in Montreal, and for anyone that was there, you would understand, I guess, the feeling where you had, 2 weeks of negotiations, and you have a spectrum of outcomes that are possible, and you could land anywhere from in the red to in the green. And at 6:12 a.m. on the Saturday morning, when it was supposed to end Friday night, the gavel was struck and decisions were pushed through, and every single issue landed in the green zone. And that's just one example of where global decision making can really help push forward policies and laws and real infrastructural and institutional change within countries. And so that ripple effect happened, and I've seen that happen over the last 5 years. And then I guess closer to home in Canada, we've seen the opinions and thought processes of Canadians change in reaction to environmental issues and to climate change. And I've seen, even just friends around me saying, oh, so UN climate change conference, they're understanding that there's something happening, or people asking me more frequently what they can do. So across the board, I would say, from whether it's companies or provincial governments or federal governments, individuals, there's a shift happening. Now, whether or not that will be fast enough to deal with the problem that we have at hand is yet to be determined. But ultimately, the window is, of course, rapidly closing in terms of the amount of time we have to create this change. But the fact that the ball is beginning to roll gives me hope that it'll pick up speed.
What would you tell people that wanted to do something about this but didn't know what to do, didn't know how, or thought it was too big and too daunting?
Well, I think that a lot of people are already creating change at home and at work, which I think is an incredible way to, it's almost expected now. It's a responsibility that we all have. But the second responsibility we all have is to hold each other accountable. One of my favorite phrases is, saying nothing is like saying it's okay. So, by not going to, let's say, the building manager of your office building and saying, listen, do we really have to have 17 degrees, air conditioning in the summer, and do we really have to have 22 degrees heat in the winter? Things like that that shift the way that we operate, that fundamentally affect kind of a longer term outcome, and changing how we live our lives has a really big impact. And that goes the same for your participation with government. So if you've never written a letter to your member of parliament, the time is today, the time was yesterday. The participation of people in our democratic society is fundamental and core to this issue moving. And at the same time, we should be paying attention to when we do make those pushes, and they don't turn out the way that we want them to. We need to push again. 2 weeks ago, we saw Canada's Climate Change Accountability Act be put through Parliament. That was a 2-year effort. It went to Senate, and for the first time in decades, Senate voted down this bill without debate. And that is unacceptable in our country, where senators are not elected. The democratic society has pushed through this climate change bill. Parliamentarians have voted it through, and yet it still stands to fail. So people need to be watching for this and understanding that we need to be continually pushing for our democratic right, and the will of the people, I think, will ultimately shift the government. This COP is important because we're supposed to be defining what's called the second commitment period. So the next stage of goals and commitments after the year 2012. So the reason why it has to be done now is so that the process is going to be put in place, so that the plans can be made, so that the targets can be made, so that those emissions can start, or that those emissions can continue to fall beyond 2012. And what we're also seeing is the U.S. is, of course, a huge part of this as one of the world's biggest emitters, or biggest polluters, I should say. And because their climate change bill also failed this year, that has really shifted the negotiations. And so countries are really trying to figure out a way to have a global, legally binding agreement that involves the United States. That is of utmost importance. And do you want me to wait?
Sure.
And what we're also seeing, of course, is a shift in willingness of other big polluters like China. Now, I say big polluters in context because China also has over 1 billion people. So on a per capita level, they're not really that big of an emitter. But you're seeing basically higher ambition coming out of developing countries, or I should say emerging economies. And you're also seeing everyone really working with, I really think, genuine ambition to try and engage the United States. So I guess we're seeing a coming together of countries, which we didn't really see last year. And so this year, that's been a shift in I guess willingness to discuss and negotiate. But what we have yet to see, and hopefully it's happening as we speak behind the meeting room doors, is a massive push of political will and compromise, and a recognition from countries that that ultimately this isn't about your economic bottom line at home. This is about the greater well-being of our neighbors, of our friends, of countries around the world, and that decisions here, while hard to make the connection, ultimately will affect the next decades to come.
What if we don't turn this around, if stuff does not start working out well, what does the future look like? What should the public know we're facing?
Well, I think that, worst case scenario, I think that people need to really push forward on government. I mean, it's not an overnight fight. I mean, or let me rephrase that. It's not an overnight challenge, and you've seen people at these conferences for 20 years, and it really takes, I think, a lot of strength to be able to step back and see the bigger picture of where you are in this shift, because it is a multi-decade project. And so whether or not in the next 12 hours a certain decision is made doesn't necessarily give a yes or no path moving forward, right? It shifts the dial a bit, for sure, and it gives us basically less time to deal with the problem. So we're ultimately only hurting ourselves if we take longer to decide on these issues. I mean, there are countries that will move ahead regardless. There are companies that will move ahead regardless. There are states and provinces that will move ahead regardless. Municipalities, they are one of the biggest leaders. They will move ahead regardless. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that while the United Nations is a very good indicator of where the world is headed, and is an excellent forum and a needed forum for discussion and to create a global picture and global direction moving forward, you still have a very large contingent of leaders in very many other sectors that will ultimately move things forward. I mean, I'm not going to stop working on climate change if today's result is not a good one, but ultimately I'm here to help ensure that that isn't so.